For centuries, the Empire of Rome existed as a bastion of paganism. Its soldiers marched under the banner of Mars, the god of war. Jupiter ruled as the patron god of Rome. Even the emperor himself came to be worshipped as a divine being. But by the 4th century AD, the empire had seen a seismic change in its religious beliefs. In the year 380, the Emperor Theodosius I recognised Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire. Today on the History Chronicles we will explore the rise of Christianity in the ancient world and the extent of its influence on the late Roman Empire. In the 1st century AD, ancient Rome ruled a vast empire which included a multitude of different beliefs, religious doctrines and cults. Of these, the Roman state exerted some preference for religious practice, much of which they had gleaned from the world of ancient Greece. Greek gods had long been absorbed into the Roman canon. Venus, the goddess of love, had emerged from the Greek goddess Aphrodite, the famed mother of Aeneas of the Trojan Wars. Mars, the god of war, was the name given to the Greek god Ares. Jupiter, the Greek Zeus, had taken pride of place as the patron god of Rome itself. Greek mythology had similarly been adapted by the Romans as large parts of Greek heritage and culture were subsumed into the imperial identity. Along with this, the Romans had developed the so-called Mos Maiorum in Latin, or in English, the Way of the Ancestors. According to Roman tradition, this so-called way had begun with the second king of Rome. It was this man, Numa Pompilius, who had built Rome's first temple of Vesta and had appointed the first pair of virgin priestesses to serve the goddess and tend to the temple's continual flame. This fire, which burned continually night and day, symbolised the fortunes of the city. If it went out, it would spell disaster for Rome. This is an excellent example of yet another practice that the Romans had drawn from the ancient Greeks, that of augury. Augury is the practice of interpreting omens or signs to foretell events and the hand that the gods were to play. Initially, this practice, and the word itself, stemmed from watching birds, but it later grew to include a wider range of fortune-telling and superstition. Along with watching birds, the Romans also sacrificed them. Animal sacrifice was a key part of Roman religion. The Latin term for it, suave taurilia, referred to a practice that could take place both in the public and in the private arena. In private, a farmer might sacrifice a pig or a calf as part of a prayer for improved fertility of his crops. In public, a greater sacrifice might occur in the temple as part of a festival, to bless an army before a major military campaign, or simply to celebrate the end of a census. By the 1st century AD, sacrifices readily took place in honour of the cult of emperor worship. This had begun first with Julius Caesar, who upon his death was recognised by the Roman state as a god. However, it was Caesar's adopted son, Augustus, who was the first to allow cities to erect temples to him while he still ruled. The cult of emperor worship became somewhat of a unifying presence in the Roman world. Although it was not hugely popular in the city of Rome itself, in the outlying provinces of Gaul, Asia and Britain, prominent centres of imperial worship became central to the Roman practice of religion. When the British Queen Boudica rose up against the Romans in Britain, for example, her rebels targeted the temple that was raised to the deified emperor in Colchester. This was viewed, according to the Roman historian Tacitus, as the citadel of eternal tyranny. But, importantly, the Roman state was not one that always imposed its religious practices on its conquered peoples. Rather than exerting religious control, Rome appeared more concerned with absorbing the deities and cults of the people that it had taken over. Just as it had done with ancient Greece, local gods were brought into the Roman pantheon. Isis from Egypt, Cybele from Anatolia, Mithras from Persia. Local religious practices were mostly encouraged rather than eradicated. This helped to keep order across the vast multicultural empire, even on the shoestring budget offered to regional governors. Even at the imperial court, cult practices from the provinces could be tolerated. The miraculous rain that saved the Roman army under Marcus Aurelius was ascribed to the work of an Egyptian magician, Anuphis, who was travelling with the army. Tolerance rather than tyranny was often the order of the day in regard to the Roman practice of religion. The reason that I'm talking so much about Roman religion here is that it will help us to see just how the Roman state was to approach a new religious idea arising from the small province on its eastern frontier. The province of Judea had become a Roman tributary at the beginning of the 1st century AD. The Jews, an ancient people with a religion predating even the earliest emperors of Rome, were at this point but one more religious group that formed the vast tapestry of religious practices in the Roman Empire. It was in Judea, of course, that a certain man by the name of Jesus of Nazareth came to the attention of the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. Jesus never left Judea during his short life, but his preaching and following among many Jews no doubt gained him the attention that led to his death sentence under the Romans. Religious tolerance was practicable to an extent, but the governor Pontius Pilate was unlikely to want to appear soft on unrest and sedition. Jesus was undoubtedly regarded as enough of a troublemaker to warrant the gruesome penalty of crucifixion. This type of death, slow and painful, was meted out only to the lowliest of criminals. Religious cults normally died out following the death of their leader, but Jesus' death was soon to have the opposite effect. Shortly after, Jesus' followers began to share news of his resurrection. By the end of the century, there emerged numerous accounts of Jesus' life and afterlife, along with the tales of his first followers who spread his teaching through Roman towns and cities. 5 of these accounts survive in Greek as the 4 Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles. These accounts of Jesus' life and deeds demonstrate the appeal of his teachings both to the Jews, but also beyond the province of Judea, to the so-called Gentiles, non-Jews living in the Roman Empire. The Gospel of Luke, for example, was written by a non-Jew. In the Acts of the Apostles, we read of the Apostle Paul of Tarsus rubbing up against the bulwark of Roman religious practice. Paul preaches to a silversmith who makes a living producing statues of the goddess Artemis for the local temple. Upon hearing Paul's message of Jesus the Christ, the statue maker fears for his livelihood in the production of man-made gods. As the followers of Jesus garnered more support in Roman towns and cities, how did the Roman state respond? At first, there appeared to be little concern among the Romans for what was effectively a small Jewish cult. Indeed, the Jews appeared more concerned with division in their ranks. It was their teachers of the law, after all, who had brought Jesus to the Roman authorities. The Roman state was soon more concerned with Jewish insurrection against Roman control of Judea. Jewish protest against taxation by Rome was met with the Roman destruction of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem and the massacre of thousands of Jews in 66 AD. War erupted in Judea between the Jews and Romans in the late 1st century, as Jews sought more control over an independent Judea. As Jews briefly took Jerusalem, bitter infighting arose among the different factions that sought to lead the uprising. As for Christians, there was not even a word to differentiate them from Jews until around 90 AD. It is estimated that many of these Jesus followers fled to Antioch at the time of this first Jewish-Roman war, a city which had become an integral part of the early Christian community. The first time we hear of Christians as a unique group of people appears in the word Christiani. This comes from Roman correspondence in a letter from Pliny, the Roman governor of Bithynia, now in Turkey, to the Emperor Trajan in 1112 AD. In it, Pliny asks the emperor how to deal with a small group of Christians that had been brought before him. Such a question clearly displays that the Roman state had no set policy on how to deal with this new, growing faith. Indeed, Pliny appears more focused on the possibility that these Christians might make trouble in the region, rather than on their religious beliefs. He writes, "Whatsoever the character of the crime be which they confess, their inflexible obstinacy certainly ought to be punished." Crucially, Pliny speaks here also of Roman citizens pursuing the mad folly of this new belief. These were to be sent to Rome for trial. He also gives us an insight into how these early Christians had begun to mark themselves out differently to Roman religious practice. The Christiani met before daybreak and recited a hymn to Christ as though he were a god. They had shown stubbornness and dissent by refusing to offer incense and wine before the image of the emperor and other Roman gods. Significantly, Pliny writes that the contagion of this superstition, Christianity, had spread not only through free cities, but into the villages and rural districts of the empire. It was clear that this new belief was growing in popularity. By around this time, the beginning of the 2nd century AD, it is estimated that the number of Christiani had grown to about 10% of the population of the Roman Empire. The imperial response, however, still appears disjointed and localised at this stage. Certainly, there were persecutions of Christians, but these were sporadic and often took place alongside persecution of other religious groups. According to the Roman historian Tacitus, the Great Fire that ravaged Rome in 64 AD was blamed on Christians by the Emperor Nero. Large persecutions of Christians in Rome followed, and some historians have suggested that it was at this time that the apostles Peter and Paul met their fate in Rome. Indeed, the number 666, ascribed to be the number of the beast in the book of Revelation, is said to derive from numerical code meaning Nero Caesar. Remember though that such violence was shortly to be followed by decades of war against Jews in the province of Judea. In contrast to the violent outburst of Nero, the Emperor Trajan's response to Pliny's letter in the 2nd century AD appears far more tepid. Pliny was instructed by the emperor to indeed go ahead and prosecute the Christians that were brought to his court, but he was not to put those on trial who had been anonymously denounced. In other words, Pliny was to respect the interests of justice and play towards the more tolerant spirit of the age, language which seems almost 21st century by comparison. The Emperor Hadrian similarly met Christians with leniency, stating that being a Christian was not in itself an illegal act in the empire. In fact, the Emperor Marcus Aurelius was just as concerned with a group of firefighters meeting in Rome, suggesting that such a group could talk politics and challenge the state as much as any Christians could. What is clear is that, by the 2nd century at least, the Roman Emperor was more concerned with the preservation of order rather than with the persecution of the followers of Christ. On a more local level, however, those who called themselves Christians certainly met with a level of persecution. These persecutions increased in the late 2nd century during the reign of Marcus Aurelius. Crucially for us, they featured a key part of how early Christians were to identify themselves and to stand out in a plethora of religious beliefs that existed in the Roman Empire. This was through the idea of martyrdom. To be a martyr was to die knowingly and in a controlled manner for a cause that one believed in passionately. To die this so-called good death was already popular practice in ancient Rome. Roman tradition had built on the Greek teachings of Socrates that celebrated self-control and calm measure in the face of pain and death. As such, suicide was a frequent and honourable practice in the Roman world. The death of Jesus Christ was not, of course, suicide, but displayed the ultimate measure of self-sacrifice, a gruesome and painful death by crucifixion. When faced with death, early followers of Christ often modelled themselves on Jesus' own fate. The apostles faced similar gruesome deaths, brought about by their own obstinacy and passionate belief in the face of persecution. Stephen, arguably the first Christian martyr, was stoned to death outside the walls of Jerusalem. Andrew died, like Jesus, on a cross. Peter was said to have shared a similar fate. It was likely that Paul of Tarsus was beheaded in Rome. As the followers of Jesus grew in number, the number of those followers who gave up their lives in passionate devotion to their Lord also increased. For the clearest picture of martyrdom in the early Christian communities, we must turn to the pages of Eusebius. Eusebius was himself a bishop, the leader of a Christian community or church, writing in 4th century Caesarea. As such, he undoubtedly had an interest in presenting his brethren in a most favourable light. That said, he was also a documentary historian and seemed keen to piece together the sources at his disposal to paint a clear picture of how early Christians were persecuted. One of the more famous instances of martyrdom in Eusebius's account arose in the city of Lyon in modern-day France. Here, in 177 AD, an unofficial movement arose that first removed Christians from public spaces such as the market and bathhouses. Christian families also began to be denounced to Roman authorities by their neighbours or even sometimes their slaves. Some were accused of incest, magic, or even cannibalism. Large numbers of Christians were arrested and tried by the Roman governor. Those that refused to recant were then subjected to a variety of punishments. Here we have Eusebius' account of Christians being fed to wild beasts in the amphitheatre, the worst of punishments traditionally directed at the lowest criminals in Roman society. According to Eusebius' account, 48 Christians died this way in the city of Lyon, including the city's bishop, Pothinus. Perhaps the most interesting example of martyrdom here, though, comes in the death of a woman called Blandina. Eusebius writes that Blandina was subjected to extreme humiliation and torture. She was exposed naked to the public and hung on a stake before wild beasts in the arena. This account of martyrdom also includes a miraculous occurrence. The beasts refused to touch this woman. Instead, she was returned to prison and then put in a net before being tossed before a charging bull. Why is this important? Well, Blandina was a slave. And what Eusebius did here was to show his audience that the possibility of a so-called good death might be available to all. From the bishop to the slave girl, all believed passionately enough in Christ to die for their faith. Eusebius' account served to demonstrate that belief in Christ was open to all and would afford everyone glory in a newly imagined afterlife, while also gaining the merits of a good death in this world. As well as appealing to the very lowest in Roman society, Eusebius may also have sought to appeal to those at the very top end too. The humble origins of Jesus and his first followers among a small fishing community in Galilee may well have troubled some of the more recent aristocratic Roman converts to the faith. Perhaps to strengthen the credentials of Jesus, Eusebius includes in his account an apocryphal story of the carpenter of Nazareth exchanging letters with a king. This man, King Abgar of Edessa, allegedly wrote to Jesus saying that he approved of his teaching and regarded him as a holy man. He wanted Jesus to visit him in Edessa to practice his healing on the king. In return, Abgar would grant Jesus sanctity from persecution by the Jews. Jesus wrote back a short but encouraging reply, stating that Abgar was indeed blessed for believing in him, but he would not travel to Edessa for he had work to finish in Jerusalem. Of course, this story does not feature in the canon of the New Testament, but it nevertheless gives us a glimpse into the ways in which those of the early church sought to broaden the appeal of Christ. As the Christian faith continued to spread across the Roman Empire, persecution became more systematized. The first officially sanctioned persecution of Christians took place in the reign of the Emperor Decius in the 3rd century AD. Decius issued an edict in 250 AD that required everyone in the empire to perform a sacrifice to the gods in the presence of a Roman magistrate. Interestingly, the Jews were exempt from this. Those that called themselves Christians were not. It is estimated that the edict led to the deaths of up to 3,500 Christians across the empire. Remember here, though, that many Christians may well have recanted their faith to escape persecution. In any case, the exact numbers on both sides remain unknown. What is important here is that, for the first time, Christians had been given the option to choose between their faith or their lives. The Emperor Valerian continued the persecution of Christians. He ordered all Christian clergy to perform sacrifices to the Roman gods in the year 257, and forbade Christians from holding meetings in cemeteries, i.e. burying their dead. The following year, it was ordered that high-ranking officials in the church were to be put to death if they would not recant. The wording of this act, which also referred to the numbers of Christians in the imperial household, demonstrated just how far belief in Christ had spread. It is worth adding here that these persecutions also served to further divide the Christian community. As a matter of fact, we should be talking about Christian communities here rather than one unified church. Christian belief had not yet been consolidated into any kind of organised doctrine. Some Christians, for example, challenged the divinity of Christ, while others accepted it wholeheartedly. Those churches that stood firm under persecution and lost many of their members often refused to then accept Christians from communities that had recanted their faith under pressure. Such division requires a video all to itself, but here serves to strengthen this idea that the Romans had no single unified policy against a single unified Christian church. The actions of the Emperor Diocletian in the late 3rd century AD mark the next turning point for Christian faith in the Roman Empire. Diocletian spent the first 15 years of his rule purging his army of Christians, and particularly targeted the privileged upper class of Christians that had gained influence in the empire. Eusebius writes that the emperor issued a full-on assault on Christian communities. An imperial letter was everywhere promulgated, ordering the razing of the churches to the ground and the burning of the holy writings, and proclaiming that those who held high office would lose their civil rights, while those in households, if they persisted in their profession of Christianity, would be deprived of their liberty. Thus Diocletian's so-called Great Persecution began. One discarded papyrus of a church in Roman Egypt shows just how far this mini-inquisition went. It concerns the account of a church reader called Ammonius in a small Egyptian village. Ammonius's church had been destroyed by the Roman authorities, and the official account written on this papyrus states that Ammonius's church possessed neither gold, nor silver, nor money, nor clothes, nor cattle, nor slaves, nor building sites, nor possessions. The document had not been signed by Ammonius, for he pled illiteracy, but by someone else on his behalf. This piece of papyrus certainly implies the complete destruction of this small church community, but it might also reveal the lengths to which early Christians went to conceal their activities from the prying eye of Roman authority. Was Ammonius really illiterate? He was, after all, meant to be the leader of this Christian community, and would read out Holy Scripture for them. Was the church really as poor as it made out on the papyrus, or had their goodies been hidden elsewhere while authorities investigated? Although this example of Ammonius rests on some conjecture, the lengths to which Christians would go to continue to meet in secret and persist in their faith have been well documented in other areas. The tunnels dug under the city of Rome in the 2nd century, for example, demonstrate the extreme tenacity that Christians would enact to preserve their faith. Despite the great persecutions, therefore, Christianity survived and continued to thrive in the Roman Empire. Diocletian's radical act in dividing the empire was also instrumental in helping Christianity to grow. In order to govern more effectively, Diocletian was the first Roman emperor to divide his empire into a power-sharing tetrarchy. While one of Diocletian's co-emperors, Galerius, shared his eagerness in the persecution of Christians, the other, Constantius, was less keen. Divisions in imperial policy were exacerbated when Diocletian made another radical step, being the first emperor in Roman history to abdicate. His abdication in the year 305 AD removed the strong presence needed to keep the power-sharing arrangement in check. This led to civil war among the next generation of Roman leaders, which ultimately proved beneficial for the Christian faith. In Italy, an usurper called Maxentius gained power with the promise of full religious toleration. Persecution of Christians was ended in the east by the Eastern Emperor Galerius in 311. An agreement between the Western Roman Emperor Constantine I and the Emperor Licinius, who controlled the Balkans, resulted in the complete acceptance of Christian belief. This document, called the Edict of Milan, went even further yet. It stated that all Christians and everybody would have the free power to follow the religion of their choice, in order that all that is divine in the heavens may be favourable and propitious towards all who are placed under our authority. Within a generation, Christianity had gone from being an enemy of the state to one of the tools for it achieving more power. But the conversion of the Roman state to Christianity was to take one final dramatic turn. Constantine had inherited the title of Western Roman Emperor, but still had one opponent before his position was secure. This man, Maxentius, had gained control of Rome and now engaged in open warfare with Constantine, despite the fact that they were both related through Constantine's marriage to Maxentius' sister. In early 312 AD, Constantine rallied his army of 40,000 men to try and oust Maxentius from his position in Italy. On the eve of battle that October, Constantine allegedly saw an image of a cross in the sky. Accompanied with this bright vision were the words, "Conquer by this." The following morning, Constantine's forces met those of Maxentius at Milvium Bridge, an important crossing point on the river Tiber. The battle that ensued was decisive, with Constantine gaining the victory and Maxentius perishing in a dramatic flight across the river, drowning with his men. Constantine now marched with his army unmolested into the city of Rome. Maxentius's body was pulled out of the Tiber and decapitated, displayed in the streets for all to see. Usually it was customary for the leader of a victorious army to offer a sacrifice at the temple of Jupiter in Rome. Here, however, Constantine paused. With his dramatic vision and his token refusal to return to the old pagan ways of ancient Rome, it appeared that the emperor's conversion to Christ was complete. His victory outside Rome was to give him almost complete control over the Western Roman Empire, paving the way for Christianity to become the most dominant religion in Rome and ultimately across the whole of Europe. But was the story that simple? Of course, this account comes from the pages of Eusebius, that same bishop mentioned earlier who clearly wanted to demonstrate the passage of Christianity through the Roman world as one of triumph and positivity. Perhaps our account needs a bit more nuance. What is clear is that Constantine demonstrated something completely new in the Roman state. He did indeed show remarkable acceptance of Christians and Christian belief in his rule. A 6th century text writes that he was responsible for the building of the first church, dedicated to St. Peter in Rome. He presided over the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD that led to the consolidation of early church doctrine. He established the city of Constantinople as the new capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. Crucially, this was to be a holy Christian city with churches rather than temples as its religious landmarks. According to Eusebius, Constantine's mother, Helena, was to lead archaeological work in the Levant that was to lead to the discovery of the true cross, that is, the cross on which Jesus Christ himself was crucified. However, there are some smoke and mirrors here. Alongside his apparent acceptance of Christianity, Constantine continued to promote some pagan practices in his empire. The Arch of Constantine, erected in Rome in 315 AD near the Colosseum, lacks Christian symbols and instead offers sculptings of Apollo, Diana and Hercules. Constantine's own coins were issued with an image of the emperor in the figure of Sol Invictus, the Roman god of the sun. Indeed, Constantine himself was only baptized on his deathbed. Scholars have debated the nature of his vision before the Battle of Milvian Bridge. Answers have emerged ranging from simply problematic eyesight to a solar flare visible at that moment. However, whatever it was that Constantine saw on that day, I argue that it appeared politically prudent to welcome the support of a growing Christian community and a seemingly successful god who could well gain him victory in the upcoming battle. Once his victory was assured, Constantine then went on to rule with a healthy mixture, balancing pagan practices from the old days with Christian ways of the new. His policies granted him a long, successful and celebrated reign as the emperor who emerged victorious from the throes of civil war. Ultimately, what I hope you have gleaned from this video is that the conversion of the Roman Empire was a long and gradual process. The Roman mantra of absorbing the cultures and religions of those it came into contact with helped the followers of Jesus to gain traction in the early stages of Christianity's growth. Once Christian belief came to be marked out and targeted for persecution, the cult of the martyr fit very well with existing Greco-Roman belief in passionate self-sacrifice that led to a good death. Also crucial in the spread of Christianity was, of course, the actions of those martyrs, the dedicated self-sacrifice and passionate faith on display, as well as the nature of Christian doctrine itself. Belief in Jesus required no genetic birthright, as did acceptance into Judaism at this time. Public displays of martyrdom testified that those from the highest positions in society down to the lowliest slave were believers. As the number of Christians in the empire grew, it was only a matter of time before it became politically prudent for those at the very top of society, ultimately the emperor, to accept the faith and put it to use for his own ends. Constantine's rule in this regard was a vital step forward for encouraging the unconstrained growth of Christianity into the upper reaches of the Roman state. From Constantine on, the Roman state was to be a Christian one. Although elements of paganism continued, they were not to persist for long. Religious debates in the empire henceforth were not about the role of Dionysius or Jupiter, but rather about the nature and purpose of Jesus Christ. Now that you've listened to my understanding of the rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire, please do let me know what you think. I'm sure that many among our audience are Christians themselves, so I ask you the question, should a history of religion be treated in the same way as history of more secular topics? Do you agree with my understanding of the rise of Christianity in the Roman world? Please do post your comments below, like and subscribe if you can, and support us on Patreon. I'll see you again for another episode of the History Chronicles.